I don't really eat bread. People know that about me. But if I go to Europe, I will probably eat some bread. Now, I also have issues with gluten. I don't really digest it well. I'm not celiac, but when I eat gluten, I don't feel right. But I don't shout it from the rooftops because I just don't have a whole lot of scientific evidence to say this is why I feel this way. But I talk to thousands of people that feel the same way. But why is it that we can travel to Europe and actually eat a baguette and eat some good bread and not have issues? As a matter of fact, so many people will travel to Europe. They'll say, I'm just gonna let my guard down. I'm gonna have this bread. I'm gonna have this good food. And then they end up losing weight. They end up feeling better. There's a huge difference, right? These are a few reasons as to why bread is so different in Europe. First off, a lot of it has to do with the harvesting in the first place. Okay, there are different practices, but first and foremost, the soil is different. There are higher levels of sulfur in the soil in Europe than there are in the United States. Now, what happens here? Well, sulfur levels are directly correlated with gliadin levels. Gliadin is the protein that is in gluten that is the actual culprit. So gliadin can trigger the increase of what is called zonulin, and zonulin is a protein which can trigger in high levels when it's activated to make the gut permeable. When the gut becomes permeable, what happens is you have an increase in lipopolysaccharides, LPS, also just a form of gram-negative bacteria. When these cross through a highly permeable gut, it initiates an immune response, which is directly correlated with higher levels of inflammation and whatnot. In fact, in the research setting, when they're trying to trigger inflammation in a body, a rodent, they will inject lipopolysaccharides because they know that it triggers an inflammatory response. So if we have lipopolysaccharides that leak through a permeable gut as a result of high levels of zonulin, you can do the math that there's going to be a problem. So by connecting dots here, although we can't say with randomized controlled trials, we can at least say strongly mechanistically, okay, more permeable gut, more lipopolysaccharides, more problems, right? And if gliadin is associated with that, then a bread that's going to have less gliadin or a pasta that's going to have less gliadin is going to be less problematic. Now, we also have other things like glyphosate and whatnot, but I'm not going to go there today because it's just too hard to have that discussion with full transparency and scientific rigor. Now, the other thing that we have to recognize is that the bread making culture in Europe is very, very different. What does bread look like in the United States? Bread in the United States, much like a lot of starchy things, it's all about preservatives. It's all about how do we get something to stay on the shelf and act as filler that is relatively cheap. So bread in the United States, it is different. It's high in sugar, it's high in preservatives. Like, why do you need to have 27 ingredients in your bread? It doesn't make a whole lot of sense, right? But in Europe, there is a demand for fresh same-day bread. I'm sure in the US, if we had the opportunity, we would want that too. We want fresh baked bread. But in Europe, there is a high demand for it, for legitimate fresh baked same day bread. Because of that, the amount of bread that has a lot of preservatives and stuff like that is much less than in the United States. So because of that, you're getting, well, already a simpler bread with less preservatives, less sugar, that, by the way, also has less gliadin in it. You can kind of get where I'm going with this. Not to mention, Europe is all about locally raised stuff or locally grown things. Simply geographically, because the way the supply chain is, it's shorter distances, so it's easier to get fresher ingredients that are not potentially grown through mono-agriculture, which we'll talk about in a second. You're getting things that are local and things that all make sense together that haven't been sitting on a truck with a bunch of preservatives because they're having to go all the way across the country or shipped overseas. It's all contained. But the grain harvesting in the first place is very, very, very different. Okay, there are tight regulations on pesticides and herbicides in Europe. Okay, there are some regulations in the US, but nothing like what it is in Europe. So what they can just spray on a crop is seemingly very, very different. Does this affect the genetic culture of the actual plant? No, I'm sure it does. But it also comes down to what are you literally ingesting? There's also something called the Common Agricultural Policy. There's good field management, okay? So that is focused on true sustainability. It's focused on the biodiversity. It's focused on the crop rotation, which is required to not deplete the soil. They also have a big focus on preventing overcropping. What does overcropping really do? Well, eventually what you're going to do is you're going to deplete the soil. Okay. And when it comes down to why some grains could be good, why vegetables have benefits, a lot of it comes down to the minerals and the nutrients that are in it. But if you have a depleted soil, do the math, right? So in the United States, it is just different. And I'm not trying to even throw shade. I'm being real here, because when I go to Europe, I want to eat all the food that I possibly can without feeling like it's going to be problematic for me. And the good thing is it's probably not going to be. So in the United States, just given geography, I want you to think about something. The United States is relatively isolated, really. We are like a giant floating island, really. Like compared to Asia, compared to Europe, like things are closer together there. We are far apart. So we're forced to kind of do things ourselves, right? In a lot of ways. You know, American grown and raised, right? It's like what we even look for as Americans. Okay, but with that, it's all about speed and volume. We're feeding a lot of people and we export. So we also need to have mono agriculture where we can consolidate and grow volume. And when we do that, it's hard to rotate crop. It's easy to overcrop. So what happens is you end up with a pretty nutrient devoid food. And you try to make a product that can be exported or can get across the country, so it's got preservatives in it. The food is flat out different. The bread is probably one of the most monumentally different things. Now this will trickle down into the other potentially preserved goods, the crackers, the snacks, things like that. Now I did put a link down below for a brand that I recommend for cleaner, better quality like snacks. They also have like sustainable meat and seafood too, but it's called Thrive Market. That's a 30% off discount link, by the way. And before you hate on me or throw shade because I'm talking about a sponsor, they support this channel and make this content possible. And it's a brand that I use, a brand that I recommend. And newsflash, you can skip through this portion, but 30% off your entire first grocery order is pretty darn awesome. So 30% off whatever you want to load up your cart with. This is awesome. Like it really is as close to European quality stuff as you can get because they don't put the garbage on their quote unquote sort of digital shelves. Anyway, so 30% off plus a free $60 gift. So that link is down below in the top line of the description underneath this video. Make sure you use that link, otherwise you can't get the 30% off. The other thing that we do have to consider, and I've talked about this in another video, is that the actual portions of bread that they eat are generally smaller. Like they might have a baguette, they might have a roll with something. But one thing that is really, really, really interesting is gonna be a little bit contrarian. Okay, with bread, for example. Bread is not insanely caloric. It is, I mean, compared to some things, but compared to like junk food, it's not as calorically dense. And what happens here is like if someone is eating wholesome bread, like good quality bread, a lot of calorie displacement happens. Now, granted, they're gonna put butter on it, stuff like that, but if the bread is so fresh and good in Europe, you don't even need the butter on it. And you can just fill up on a few hundred calories of bread versus something that's super calorically dense and covered in seed oils and saturated fat. So they're not making bread with seed oils and things like that. They're making bread the old-fashioned way. So having a little bit of volume of this bread might displace some of the other stuff. Let's talk about the trickle-down effect. Okay, because food marketing is very different in Europe than it is in the United States. Like there's strict guidelines on how you can market food. And I talk about this because it goes down into the snacks too, right? Like, as if you're looking at even a preserved cracker or even cereals, and you are getting it from a grain that is grown in sulfur-rich, nutrient-rich soils, even if preservatives are added to it, remember that the preservative guidelines are significantly different. So it's going to be a better, like arguably less dangerous preservative. You're going to have a higher quality grain. You're going to have something that is relatively locally sourced. So even the quote unquote processed food is different. The ultra processed foods, which of course are coming a lot of times from the United States, are designed for export over there. So having an occasional processed food is not going to be as problematic. If you sit down at a French restaurant and you have some crackers and brie, you'll notice that even the crackers feel different. Have you ever seen that? If you've been to Europe, like the crackers are different. If you go to anywhere where you're going to have anything that is like flour based, even the pasta is different, right? People all the time go to Italy and they eat pasta and they don't have as much of a problem with it. What about refined sugars and things like that? Refined sugar is still going to be refined sugar, but given the quality of some of the other ingredients, they probably get canceled out quite a bit better. So how do we adopt these principles the best that we can in the United States? If you can bake sourdough at home, Because sourdough is fermented, some of that fermentation can break down some of the sugars and some of the proteins, and it becomes somewhat of a microbially active food. So if you had to choose a bread, choose a sourdough. If you had to choose a bread that's even better, make your own sourdough. But it's a monumental task and something that a lot of like homestead type people are doing, and it's interesting, and I recommend it. The other things that you can do is you can look for foods that don't have the preservatives and don't have the additives. They do exist. Okay? But you can also rely on higher quality bread from bakeries that are baking the same day rather than just going for, whatever is on the shelf. Such a stark difference between the bread that is on a shelf that has 27 ingredients and the bread that has 5 coming from your local French bakery. As always, keep it locked in here on my channel. I'll see you tomorrow.